So I'm Molly from the IED. As I said, I will be the one hosting. We have a wonderful panel here to discuss medtech and how user-focused kind of works in this. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So I think we'll start with Richard.
Good evening, everyone. My name's Rich Timbrell. I'm the incoming design manager for a global medtech leader in infection control and biodecontamination solutions. My background spans about 10 years of medical device design, initially in the field of drug delivery for neurodegenerative diseases, and more recently in the field of orthopedics. I'm also a chartered engineer with the IED and one of the current vice chairs of council. So I guess just early on behalf of council, thank you to everybody that has joined today, and thank you to all the panel members as well. In terms of my experience with medical device users, my background is very physical product focused. So it's great to be sharing the panel with some people that I know are much more active in the digital space as well. And I've been involved in interactions with users at all stages of the product development process, from sort of concept ideation through preclinical trials, clinical studies, working with surgeon groups and development of medical devices for some major OEM partners.
Amazing. Stuart?
Hi, I'm Stuart Grant. I've been in medtech my entire career since like 1999. I started off as a design engineer and worked up through engineering. I'm now a chartered engineer, and I've got a PhD in medtech innovation, and my PhD research focused on the front end of innovation. So understanding what the users are telling us, trying to interpret that analysis into design input, some of the things we're going to talk about now. So now I work J&J for 22 years in orthopedics and surgical here in the UK, 7 years in the US and 5 years in China. I've been back in the UK for about 6 years. And now I run my own management consultancy, helping startups and scale-ups develop their medical devices and get them to market as quickly as possible. So taking them through the design, the engineering, the front end, of course, the manufacturing, understand the whole innovation journey, regulatory and quality, and get it to market and help them commercialize it as quickly and efficiently as possible. So that's me.
Brilliant.
I think we can post all our LinkedIn on the chat so people can link in with us, the panel members as well. Would be a good idea.
You can do that. Laurie?
Hello. So my name's Laurie Rowe. As well as running Red MedTech, I'm also a industry professor at the Engineering Design Institute London, and I'm an incorporated engineer with the IED, been with them for a long time. Also been in medtech for a long time, been in industry for over 20 years, and be celebrating my 20th year in the medtech sector this week, which is lovely. And so it's nice to have this webinar at this perfect timing. Basically, Red MedTech, we're a consultancy. We cover medical devices, so general devices, in vitro diagnostics, software as a medical device, and all kinds of products from, I've designed hip implants, drug delivery products, laparoscopic surgical equipment to help you move, improve mobility. Recently, we're working in deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's disease. You name it, if it's medical devices, I love working on it. My background's in designing and engineering the medical devices, and similar to the guys, I've worked across the entire product development lifecycle, from concept and initiation all the way through to delivering it on the market and fulfilling post-market obligations. As a consultancy, we cover the healthcare innovation side, so that's the product development side and the project management, sort of project guidance, and we also cover the compliance side, so your quality management systems, your framework for your company, and also the regulatory compliance, so ensuring that you've got the necessary clearances to demonstrate safety for your product and to place it on market. So yeah, that's us in a nutshell.
Amazing. And Matt?
Hi everyone. Yeah, so as Richard kind of pointed out there, my background is very much in digital design rather than physical product design. So my career spans 20 years in user-centered design. I've worked across multiple sectors, from e-commerce through e-gaming, education, more regulated fields like fintech and insurtech. And for the past 4 years, I have been in medtech. So I was a colleague for part of Stuart's career, only a couple of years, but I was at J&J, where I led digital design for orthopedics. And then I left J&J and I formed a design agency called Hodgkinson McCambridge. We specialize in health tech. We obviously bring the digital design aspects forward, but we also specialize in patient public involvement. And we also do a lot of physical usability testing as well, physical device usability testing. So yeah, I'm sure we've got plenty of salient points to bring to the table today. So good to meet everyone.
Amazing. So before we get into the questions, the way this will work is that I will be proposing some questions for our panel to discuss. At the end of the discussion, we'll have some time for some Q&A and we'll open it up to our panel. Right. So first question. How can engineering teams effectively integrate diverse user perspectives early in the front end of the innovation phase to ensure that clinical relevance and pattern safety? Richard, would you like to kick us off?
So I think, first of all, we should acknowledge that the most important person in the design and the industrialization of medical device is the user. The design development process, or the design control model that's outlined in various different medical standards, ISO 13485 is probably the most common one, are pretty well defined, but ultimately begin with an intended purpose for your medical device and a set of user needs. And without this, kind of the model for design and development falls apart. The second thing to note is that it's not always clear and obvious who the user or users of your medical device are. For instance, if you take something relatively simple like a hammer used in orthopedics, it has a fairly simple mode of action. The clear user is the surgeon, and the clinical benefit is to the patient, but the device also interfaces with lots of other stakeholders throughout the process. So nurses, decontamination specialists, sterile services, I'm sure there's others as well. And one of the really common pitfalls is to not capture those early on in the design process. So to design with only the primary or maybe the most obvious user in mind. In terms of diversity of user voice, it's of critical importance to remove bias from your user needs and to ensure that where possible you're sort of designing for the population of users, not just a subset of your population. I guess if you were designing a new EpiPen for sake of argument, but you only captured user needs from individuals who've been using EpiPens for their whole lives, you're going to end up with a set of user needs that are quite niche and quite bounded by the group that you've used to form them. The device actually might be used by a really inexperienced user or administered by a nurse or a doctor in a hospital setting. So I guess the point that I'm getting at is diversity is really important in terms of the role the user has, the experience they have with the devices, and also consideration of kind of potential users' different physical characteristics as well, and capturing those in the front end is really, really important to medical device design.
Wonderful. Would anyone like to add anything?
Sure, I will go next. So I agree with Richard, but I also like to caveat this is medical devices, you do have a lot of different users through that medical devices journey. And if you're, depending where you're working in your background, you have to be cognizant that the time it takes and the money it takes as well to engage every user. And if you're a startup, you might not have that opportunity. So you need to weigh up cost and time and getting enough user input. And there's some papers about how many interviews you should do. There's a very famous one from 1993 saying 30 is enough to get as much user inputs as you require. That wasn't in medical devices, but it was in consumer goods. But the thing is, yes, you can map all your users out, And before you start going asking them, you need to analyze what sort of information you're going to get from that user is really important. And maybe you go and do 1 or 2 interviews with all the different users, understand where they are, and then analyze that before you go and spend more money and more time to see if it's actually giving you value. Because we have to know that as engineers, we're also experts as well, and we can provide a lot of the user inputs already without talking to users. And there's some literature out there saying, don't even bother going asking the users because they don't know what they're talking about. So it's a waste of time and effort. So you've got a spectrum here. You've got ask the users everything you could possibly want to know, or don't bother because they don't know how to answer the question anyway. You're asking them, so they'll give you tough advice. So as an engineer, it's really an art to engaging your users of where you're going to find that information and what information you're actually looking for, what question you're trying to answer. And one last point, and in medical devices, we sometimes break our customers or users down into the 5 Ps, which helps you to remember them. You got the patient, the physician, is either a doctor or whoever, all healthcare professionals are called a physician because it just fits in with the P. The payer, which in the US is quite important, and in private healthcare is quite important. You got the provider. So in the UK, payer and provider, obviously the NHS is one and the same, but it's not always the same. And then finally, you've got the policy maker, which is the EU here in the, well, not in the UK anymore, but the EU MDR, MHRA or the FDA are policymakers. And you think about they're all the types of users that interact with your product. It starts to break it down and make it feel a little bit better. It's not just the hospital environment that product is engaging with.
And I think you raise a valid point about interviews. I think it's important to consider the types of techniques that you're using in usability. And I get your point that, do you just ask users, do they really know how to articulate their needs? So I think it's worth considering to look at observational techniques so that you actually observe those users in their natural environment, going about their normal tasks, so you can understand a little bit more, kind of see things through their lens a little bit more, and sort of reveal the unarticulated needs and some of the challenges that they might face in their workflows that your traditional survey techniques might miss. So the point I'm making is to consider, a selection of techniques, when you're looking at these. And I think as well, to sort of slightly to sort of dissect your question, Molly, it's like you're talking about, we're looking at this early in the process, and I think that's a really important point to get across, is that this needs to be early and it needs to be continuous engagement. So, and we make that it isn't a one-time event, I suppose, is what I'm trying to communicate with this. So yeah, I think that would be my sort of advice, is look at the different techniques as well as interviews, and obviously make sure that you understand, as Stuart and Richard pointed out, like, consider who those users are, because it might not just be as straightforward as a patient or a clinician, that there's people in that wider ecosystem. So mapping that can be really useful to understand what your objectives are when you're looking at things like task analysis.
Mm-hmm. No, that I completely agree there, and I think some of the points I was kind of going to make then is, we've done some studies in the past where, very much we've been engaged at the right time. We are putting concepts in front of people at the right part of the design phase to get those inputs while things are still quite immature and lots of changes can be made, which is great. But sometimes it's kind of the lens of, and this is kind of blending a little bit of what Stuart was saying, you are working with experts, we are experts in this, but when we kind of put devices in front of people, there is absolutely that kind of lens of, from a usability perspective, this is great, it's logical, it all makes sense, But then if we're talking about a piece of capital equipment, the use case is, there might be cables dangling in front of the screen, there might be other things here. And then, like you say, unless you're there in the workflow, seeing how these happen, doing that ethnographic kind of study, then those are the kind of things that can get missed. And, obviously that happens a lot in digital specific products as well, where, you have a really awesome product, but it just won't get used because it's just too complicated to put into the mix of an already busy workflow. So yeah, absolutely agree with those points. And I think the other aspect that maybe we haven't touched upon yet, and maybe I'm a little bit sensitive to it, kind of given my background and where I sit in medical device manufacture, but when we are kind of working on those kind of capital devices where there is a digital screen on there and then there's kind of physical buttons and things like that as well, it's bringing that collaborative way of working together as well. So it's no good having a silo of digital, a silo of product, and then all just going off doing great work, but then when it comes together it just doesn't sit, it doesn't work. So yeah, definitely kind of, it's not only about involving the end users as quickly as possible, but it's kind of getting that kind of cross collaboration working as well.
Can I just add something to this?
Sure.
The question that Molly asked was about the front end of innovation, not about usability engineering. They're two different considerations of engaging the user. We've gone off to about talking about usability engineering, which is further down the development pathway and is a different thing than the front end of innovation, where you're trying to find the clinical problems and understand the clinical problem. You're not trying to validate the solution. So let's make sure, as a panel, we're talking about two different things here. Front-end innovation, which was the question, not usability engineering.
No, I completely agree with you, Stuart, and I guess that's why I raised the point about sort of the wider group, because it's exactly in that space that, as Laurie raised, you can go in, you can see how similar devices are being used, similar workflows are being used around the hospital, and that's the opportunity to go in and not necessarily conduct formal usability studies, but go and ask questions, go and speak to surgeons when you're observing an operation, or go and talk to the nurse in the waiting room and see how those things interface throughout their life cycle. And I think Stuart's point around the individual not always necessarily knowing what they want or need is really important. There's also an art from an engineering perspective to collecting that information and then dissecting what information you are going to take into your design, and what you're not going to take in, and the things that you aren't going to take in, why you're not going to take them in.
Yeah, and I think that, to go, as you quite rightly point out, back to the question, we're looking at the front end innovation phase, and we're looking at ensuring clinical relevance and patient safety. By default, you certainly mentioned earlier 13485, we automatically sort of go straight into the medical device standards because that's what they're there for. When we think patient safety, we automatically think of the risk management standard. And when we're thinking about user perspectives, it's quite easy for us to slip into that, oh, that means usability, which sits within the wider risk management processes for devices. So I think it's going back to like the clinical relevance side of it as well, is understanding maybe the wider clinical needs, and like almost sometimes challenging that, like, yes, it could be a good invention and it might be able to sort of help a patient in a certain way, but you also have to look at things like adoption. So one specific, take orthopedics, for example, or surgery, one specific surgical technique might be done widely throughout one geographical region, yet it's not adopted at all in another geographical region, simply because they're not taught that way. They use a different clinical philosophy. And so you've got to almost like go back to the start of understanding what it is you're trying to achieve and the why before the how. And also when we're looking at the question, we're looking at engineering teams. And I'm going to sort of reference what you were saying, Matt, is that there's a lot of us. There's different people in the mix, isn't there? You've got your usability engineers, you've got your hardware team, got your software team, got mechanical. Everybody's come from different backgrounds and different levels of engineering and experience as well. So I think it's important to embrace that diversity across all levels.
So going off of that, and on to our next question, how important would you say that the voice of the user, how that it be translated into the design inputs that are both measurable and compliant with the regulatory design controls that we have in this country and also globally? Laurie, would you like to start us off?
I'm going to be perhaps a little bit unconventional, especially as like somebody that provides regulatory consulting. And I would say, you know, my personal approach isn't to run towards the regulation straight away. This is me showing my true colours as a design engineer and inventor at heart. So I think, yeah, that can come later. We will work within those frameworks, but primarily look at what we are trying to achieve in terms of design inputs. What are the user needs? What is the features and the functionality? Of course, we'll get to the regulatory compliance and design controls and all of that. But first, let's do that exploratory work to understand what the voice of user is. And by voice of user, I mean articulated and not articulated, observed, and also like what the market looks like as well. So when you're designing this product, let's understand what I mentioned, you know, geographical regions that you're looking at, what's the consumer profile in those areas. So really identifying and knowing who your user is first and foremost. And then, of course, the regulations will kick in because your geographical areas that you want to place your device on market will, you know, the jurisdictions dictate your regulatory stuff. So that will fall into place. But first and foremost, focus on the product design and the engineering, I'd suggest. Yeah.
So I guess we talked a lot about different experiences and different focuses in medical devices, and I entirely agree with Laurie. I think we'll maybe talk a bit about front-end innovation a little bit later and where it fits in. And I completely agree with you've got two elements to developing a medical device, right? You've got the design of the thing of the medical device, and then the demonstration that the device meets the regulatory requirements and meets your user needs and meets your design inputs. So I guess that's the sort of design control piece, and ultimately that design control model, we in whatever fashion we decide to do it, you've got a set of user needs that you need to turn into a series of clear, unambiguous, non-conflicting and testable design inputs. And in order to do that, there's various different ways to doing that. You can drive some of those from industry standards, something like IEC 60601. If you were developing an electronic medical device of some sort, and you have a particular user need that has a design input associated with it, that you can drive from that source of specification. But the more challenging ones are where you need to do some form of characterization study to create effective design inputs, and then map those onto your user needs. So an example for that would be you want the device to be robust when used by the user. Really rubbish user need, but let's go with it for a minute. And you might decide that the design input associated with that is the amount of is the device must withstand an amount of force put through it by a user. So that would be a time you could go out and characterize your representative population and use that as the source of specification to drive that design input to link to that user need.
Yeah, I think like absolutely, I agree with that piece. I think some of the conversations that we have, it's, you know, you kind of come away with really trying to understand that kind of user need, and it's sometimes frustrating that maybe you come away with, oh well, I just need it to be like really simple to use, and it's like, okay, but how's that measurable? How do we translate that into an actual design input? And I think you can develop a framework which begins to categorize those things, kind of how we was talking about then, and then if you do a little bit more probing, you can maybe translate that into, okay, well what would make it, what would make it feel simple, what would make it easy to be used. And again, kind of going back to what we talked about in that previous question, when you kind of put yourself into the space of the device in the future being used, it's, well, I need to see what's on the screen from the other side of the OR, and it's like, okay, so actually what you need then is clear feedback that the device is running. So that then is a measurable requirement. You can now get visual auditory confirmation, whatever that needs to be, but you have something tangible rather than just a quite ambiguous, simple, easy kind of input there. So yeah, kind of only really validated what you said then, but it makes a lot of sense.
I'll add a little bit. So it's very hard to systematically translate user needs into design inputs, and that's why we got the question. In the design control process we're familiar with, where it's very waterfall driven, you do design inputs, you do your outputs, verification, validation, transfer. And people expect you get all these big long list of user needs, and then you systematically translate them into your engineering requirements that are measurable in that sort of thing. But what we've got to do as engineers is we've got to take those user needs, experiment with them, understand where we're actually going to be, and then start going backwards and filling in our engineering requirements once we understand how the concept's really going to work, how we're going to fulfill those user needs. And as you go through the system, through the product development process, your user needs and your design requirements evolve. And they're usually never set until the very end. And even if post-market, you might be coming up with new user needs as you learn more as it goes into the market. So you've got to think about, they're always evolving. You're always adding to the, if you think of it as a list, adding to the list of user needs and adding to the list of design requirements, and they're driving each other as you're going through those design iterations and you're learning and you're getting that feedback. But to directly answer the question, there is tools out there to translate those user needs, understand exactly what syntax and grammar you should be using, how you should be saying greater than or less than or equal to, and the tolerancing around writing those engineering requirements is really critical. And if you get those right, then that drives your risk management, and your verification, your validation, because you should be verifying to your engineering requirements. And that's why your engineering requirements needs to be measurable, but also have a direction. It needs to be 1,000 Newton strength, greater than, less than, plus or minus 10 Newtons, whatever it's going to be. It always has to be measurable, and that drives your verification and then your risk assessments. But as I said, it's always a learning process as you go through the MPD process, and don't expect at the beginning that you're going to have a full list of complete user needs and engineering requirements, because that's never true. Even what your procedures and processes tell you it's going to happen, it's not. It's only going to happen at the end of the process, where you submit this beautiful document to the notified body.
Yeah, oh, go on, Laurie.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I agree with it. I'm not necessarily sure 100% agree about the user needs not being stabilized till the end, because of I think what plays a part in the systematic nature of the translation is iterative development. And I think that's the point that I would agree with you on, in that there should be iterative development. So you're taking user needs. These are often qualitative, rather than very specific and measurable and easily verifiable. That's why we validate user needs, and we're translating those into measurable requirements, like you said, tolerances, force values, whether they're driven by standards or not, because depending on the level of innovation, there might not be a vertical standard for that specific product. I mean, orthopedics, there's certainly quite a lot out there. For example, having designed hip implants, just off the top of my head example, you do have specific requirements you need to design to, and there's lots of shells in those kind of standards. Where there isn't, and we're innovating, kind of got a lot more flexibility and free reign, but we still need to be able to put those into measurable kind of things. So discussing things like easy to use, like Matt was saying, those kind of concepts. What do we actually mean? Do we mean you want it to be easy to use, means you can set a product up within 5 minutes, or that it requires only, I don't know, 3 or 4 steps, and then you're delivering a therapy of some kind, you know? So it's doing that and then iterating that. Those user needs will change slightly because you're going to go through the process of taking your concepts, trying them with your users, and then getting that feedback, and it might change your perception. So I think you need to be open-minded to that. You will get to have a design freeze at some point, because otherwise that just presents, you know, a nightmare for a project manager like me that's got to sort of hit those milestones and get it out of the door at a certain time. So yeah,
well,
I think
I guess the question comes down as, what type of product are you developing? An incremental or radical one? An incremental one, you can set your user needs and your design requirements pretty early on and go through the mechanical sausage making process. Not very interesting, but you can do that. But from a learning environment, I've always hated the term design freeze. If you know, we have multiple generations of products, because design freeze is sort of never really happens. You can defrost it anytime you like if you find a new user need that you haven't addressed, or you get to the end and you're doing some more testing, you want to do some more usability engineering, whatever you're doing, some validation, and you think, why have we got this feature here? And we realized that that feature that we were so excited about is somewhat irrelevant to the user now. Maybe technology or society's moved on, and you remove it, and it removes all of your whatever's related to that, all the testing, the design requirements, user needs, all removed from your design control process. In the same way, you might find a new feature that you need to add, and you have to add it all the way back into your design control process. And that, in this world, we have to be as flexible as we can in our product development. That's why the waterfall process is never really used anymore. It's shown in nice slides, but most engineers don't actually pay any attention to it deliberately, because we're trying to develop the best product we can, not follow the process.
So going off of that, in your experience, how do engineering teams navigate these strict regulations that they have to follow, while still, you know, delivering user needs and being more innovative? I swear I said that word right. Matt, would you like to start us off?
Gosh, yes. So I think, just trying to unpack the question a little bit there. I think quite often, like what I've come across is regulatory tends to be seen as this blocker, rather than being an actual constraint of the design. And I think some of the more effective teams that, you know, I've kind of either worked in or kind of worked with have actually been able to kind of build that compliance into the creative process, rather than it kind of like what I was talking about then being we'll face into that when we need to face into it, but let's just go and do our creative bit up front and then worry about it later. And as we know, that's never really quicker. It might look quicker on paper, it might not, but definitely where I see this the most is kind of working in with startups. So, you know, quite often, you know, funds are hard to come across. So we work into really tight constraints. There's the momentum to, you know, we need to get to the next funding round. We need to have something tangible. We need to have moved across the TRL level or whatever to kind of just unlock that next bit of funding. So therefore, we're just going to throw everything into the design. And like I've just kind of said, we'll worry about regulatory later. But obviously, you know, you're missing out the documentation. Things aren't always that simple. You can't really come back to it. You're missing out risk checkpoints. It just doesn't work. So what we try and help people to do is just kind of build in quite lightweight, and this kind of pulls back to what Stuart was saying, you know, in a more perhaps agile way of working. You know, we can build in design reviews, we can have kind of fortnightly check-ins, things like that, and just make sure that decisions that are being made, there's some documentation about why, you know, what's happened, what's the result of that. Kind of it seems more lightweight, but it's still doing the job that it needs to be there, and it makes sure that we're not losing anything from that regulatory perspective, whilst finding that balance of still being able to move at pace, which is, you know, what we're all looking to do. And I think, you know, definitely for me, who, you know, have the least amount of time served in med devices on this panel, I can say with good authority that, you know, language is really important when it comes to regulatory. And, you know, when you have a multidisciplinary team, and again, in that startup environment, particularly where, you know, people come from all kind of varied backgrounds, you know, people don't always talk in the same way. And therefore, you know, again, if we can bring people together in that kind of shared ritual environment, we bring in the mixed reviews, we have, you know, demos to a wider audience of people, it helps to bridge that gap. It gets everyone speaking the same language, everyone can contribute to it, and, you know, all the priorities are captured, and everything hopefully aligns nicely. Yeah, I think that's my 2 cents.
So I think for me, the most successful engineering teams that I've worked in terms of delivering medical devices to market, and I guess I take Stuart's point earlier about the difference between a real groundbreaking new medical device versus an incremental improvement on a well-established technology. But for me, they foster a culture of the right level of innovation at the right time. And what I mean by that is that the system allows the individuals working within it to use their particular skills at the appropriate phases of development. I think I might slightly unfairly generalize here, but in my experience, there's 2 types of engineers working in R&D in the medical field. There's real innovators that come up with real groundbreaking solutions to patient needs, and there's individuals that can deliver devices to market. And there's some overlap between those, and there's some that will do well in both, but generally they're the sort of two pockets of engineers. And it's important that the system allows the individuals to work together and to flourish at the right time. And then outside of R&D, there's obviously a lot of cross-functional work that goes on in medical device development, as Matthew touched on. But understanding who you're working with, what the roles of the other teams are, other disciplines are, bringing them in at the right time to ensure that novel ideas are de-risked early, and that you all agree on the route to market, the required documentation, as Matt mentioned, at the right time. They're all really important things for making sure that you get an effective medical device onto market.
Yeah, I totally agree. And with respect to R&D and Matt's point about the language, the way that we use language when we're talking about design development and design control, we're talking about design and development. That is not R&D in my world. We don't use those linguistics. R&D it's innovating, it's sandbox, it's almost like engineers' playtime where you're exploring and you're breaking stuff and you're sort of challenging boundaries and you're sciencing. There's a difference between that, and there's an appropriate point in time when that lovely creation and kind of viable concept needs transitioning from R&D, research and development, and into design and development. And that, in our practice at least, is where design controls kick in. And that's where we do have the regulatory rigor. So we are going to apply regulations, and it's not going to be an afterthought, and we do apply design for compliance. Going back to the earlier question, when we're talking about voice of customer, focus on the voice of the customer, focus on your users, focus on what they're needing. Just give the regulation, just put those to one side for 5 minutes, because there'll be plenty of time for them. They kick in with design controls and with those processes. And like it or not, to get a device to market, we still need to generate the evidence per the regulations. So we do have to strike that balance. We do have to kind of toe the line to a certain degree, and navigate that between innovation and what the regs require. And I also would just support with that point by saying, don't get confused between regulatory requirements and standards, because there's differences between directives, regulations, standards and guidelines. They're all slightly different vehicles, and they'll all have a slightly different impact as you're iterating your design through the development life cycle.
Well, I'll add the last point to this one then. So to navigate, there's 2 points here: to innovation and creativity and regulations or constraints. Contrary to what most people think, creativity happens in constraints. You're trying to come up with the creative solution with all the constraints around you. That's what creativity is. And obviously then that drives innovation. So the regulations are just part of the constraints that we have to deal with. We can't avoid them. We have to take them head on. And as an engineer, early in my career, I was given the design control processes as part of the company I worked for to manage. And I didn't enjoy it. It was a pain writing these design control procedures, keeping them up to date, listen to the quality of the manufacturing and the regulatory people, and inputting it all was a real pain to do early in my career. And I was probably just given it because I was the most junior engineer in the office at the time. But as I progressed through my career, I realized knowing the standards and the design control processes within that company back to front, because I wrote them all, was a real benefit to my innovation process, because I knew what I had to do and what I didn't have to do. And the didn't have to do things is really important, because you'll get a lot of people coming to your desk saying, oh, you should do that in your risk management, you should do this in usability engineering. And if you can point to the standard and say, it doesn't tell me to do it here, mate, on your bike, you've saved yourself a load of time. But a lot of engineers will go and do work that's not really required in the procedures. So I know reading procedures and reading standards is incredibly boring, and we're engineers and we don't like to read, but to improve the product development process you're going through, I think one of the things you've got to do is start churning through all the standards and procedures and nearly memorizing them and know exactly what it says, so you can navigate them as efficiently as possible and not have to go and ask people how you do something, because you already know how to do it and you know what to do.
I completely agree with that. I think Stuart touched on a point there, which is there's quite a small series of activities that are required from medical device design. Lots of medical device companies fall into the trap of writing really long, complicated procedures to cover what are essentially quite a small, relatively easy to achieve set of requirements. Yeah, I've worked in companies before where you look at a procedure and you could strip 2/3 of the procedure out and still be compliant. So I completely agree. Going that step beyond your individual company's procedure and knowing what you actually need to do completely gives you the best chance of creating a medical device.
Yeah, and one of the points of this is simple: is when you've got your user needs and your engineering requirements. Some of your user needs and engineering requirements are there for compliance reasons and quality reasons. There's a bunch more that are business-related requirements, like cost of goods sold, which is really important for an engineer to know how much you can develop the product for. But it shouldn't be going into your compliance documents. It shouldn't be weighing down your compliance documents. So really be clear, is like, okay, this is a business requirement. It's not a compliance patient safety requirement. So I'm going to keep that on a separate list over here and have the compliance ones here. So those sort of things you need to be really aware of when you're going through the product development process.
And I think that ability to compartmentalize and understand the why behind what you're doing is really critical, isn't it? Because it allows you to then, when it comes to challenging designs and you're going through your design review, it's going to help you and enable you to look at prioritization. So time to time, or occasionally quite frequently, you can get these conflicting requirements, or you can get, I don't know, I've been in plenty of meetings where there's other functions within the team. There might be like marketing, might be sales, want to add bells and whistles. We've got sort of regulatory sort of saying, you've got to comply to this. And sometimes you might end up with these conflicting requirements, and being able to prioritize those and understand the weighting of those is really important, isn't it? And it's understanding this. That's the same with the standards, is understanding the why a certain feature or an attribute is a should or a shall, you know, what the weighting is according to the standard. Is it mandatory, or is it optional? Is there flexibility there? And I think that, yeah, being able to sort of manage that kind of situation is part of an engineer's skill set, is navigating that, just like the same as when you're navigating innovation. And as you quite rightly said, not being sort of straitjacketed by the regulatory requirements. Because I, to be honest, I've never seen a project that I can think off the top of my head that was like completely killed by regulation. There's always scope to, as you say, there's always scope within it if you understand the depth of the regulation and what the actual intent, what they're trying to do. I mean, a lot of it just drives back to patient safety, to be honest. That's the key driver behind most of it. And, you know, I think that's being able to do that. Most engineers, if you're smart enough to engineer a product, you're smart enough to navigate the regulations, even if it is a little bit of, you know, slightly dry reading at times. It's usually worth the wait. And same as you, Stuart, I remember being asked to do risk management procedures and things like that in my early careers. And I remember thinking, oh, the design director's given me this job to do. What have I done wrong? Am I on his bad books and he's given me this to do? Next thing, I've got the first 510K for the company under their belt. So that enabled us to access the US market. And we got a 13485 certificate for our quality management system, which again was a significant kind of breakthrough. And it wouldn't have been enabled if we hadn't gone through the little bit of rough that goes with the smooth and loveliness that is product design engineering.
So, Laurie and Stuart, you both mentioned risk management. Are there any strategies that could be applied that help balance the user needs with technical feasibility and risk management during the design, verification, and validation activities? Stuart, do you want to kick things off?
I read this question and I was like, that's what an engineering degree teaches you. And all the tools and techniques and all experience is like, it's basically, the strategies are what an engineer is and what they know is balance it as you go through the product development process. You're designing that product, like, can I make it? How much is it going to cost? What components and stuff do I need? How is it going to be manufactured? Is it going to be strong enough? Is it have the performance? And you're balancing in your head, creating all these ideas to come around all these problems simultaneously. And that's, I guess, I can't answer the question because that's what engineers and designers do, and what we've been educated to do is continuously balance these as we're going through the product development process. And it's all the tools and techniques that we're taught to do it. So FEA, I won't mention all the engineering tools, you know them all, but that's my short answer anyway.
And I think maybe to sort of slightly sort of dissect that question, and I'd almost sort of go, why would I need to? So why do I need to balance user needs and technical feasibility and risk management? Because in my head, I've got user needs, because it needs to achieve its clinical purpose, and risk management, well, it needs to be safe. So they're fundamental. There's no compromises there. I've got to get my documentation started to demonstrate that it's safe, because it's not going to out the door otherwise. And nobody's going to buy it if it's not going to meet those clinical needs, or if it's not satisfying to use. And that's one of the words that comes up in the usability standard. I've got that on my brain because I've been auditing a company's usability process today. So I'm looking at not just user risk, but I'm also looking at, is it satisfying? Is it effective? Is it efficient to use this product? So I'd kind of group the user need, usability, and risk management as one side of it. The technical feasibility of doing it, that's another thing, right? We've got to sort of think, how are we going to breathe life into this product? It might be implementing new technologies. It might be something with supercritical key interfaces with could be lots of tolerance stacking going on, you know, and understanding that's where your design verification is going to kick in. Then you're going to look at what you're trying to achieve and what's actually physically possible within the realms of reality and current manufacturing technology. And as you said, Stuart, keeping an eye on your cost of goods. You know, you might be able to attain high precision, but at what cost? And is that going to have a knock-on effect that then disrupts your commercial thing because you've ended up with a lovely product, it's gorgeous, but it's expensive to make because it's so super precise, when perhaps it doesn't need to be. So this goes back to managing the conflict and requirements I talked about earlier. And then just to sort of loop back round, if we consider done our user needs, we've got our technical feasibility and risk management, so we've proven it's safe, we've got that verification as part of that design sort of feasibility process. We're then going to loop back around with our validation activities. Are we designing something that meets those user needs and those safety requirements? So I would sort of I chop up that question in a slightly different way in the way that I work, to be honest. But yeah, it's a good one, and it hits all the key points of the processes, definitely.
Yeah, I'd completely agree. I don't really have a lot to add, I think, to what you both said on this so far, but definitely the bit there, Laurie, that kind of jumped out to me was too often, I think, risk is separated out from usability when actually, you know, they need to, as you said, be absolutely addressed at the same time. You know, it's if you look at risk through that lens of actual human behavior and what people are trying to do, you can come up with solutions that don't then kind of knock out the usability side of it. Like, oh, that's a risk, let's just remove that feature, or let's make it harder to do this and that. It is kind of finding that balance, isn't it? And you have to do that by treating everything as one combined, you know, aspect rather than those individual pieces. So yeah, not a lot to add on that one, but yeah, interesting.
I think I've got even less to add to this one. I think it's been covered really well by the other three members, and yeah, I agree on all points.
Brilliant. So then that leads us to our final question. How do you think the real-world data and user feedback collected during post-market surveillance, how can it be used to identify any unmet needs or any of the design shortcomings in a quick way so that things can stay on track and progress?
Do you want me to kick this one off?
So
I guess having a post-market surveillance plan's a requirement of medical devices, but having an effective process for conducting post-market surveillance is a slightly different thing. And it allows you to track not only how your device that's on market is performing, but also to observe changes in user behavior. I think we touched on that a little bit earlier. And that's really important for fostering continuous improvement, generation of potential new user needs, changes in design inputs as well. And appropriately timed cross-functional post-market surveillance meetings and feedback allows those post-design transfer improvements to be made. And it's also probably the opportunity that you get to review probably the richest set of direct user data that you'll get, because you're almost certainly, when you've got a device on market, you're going to have more people using it than you've used to characterize your device in the first place. So yeah, I think it's really important, and it's probably, particularly when you're doing iterative development of products for devices that are on market doing something in a similar way or an improvement on an existing one, it's so important to have an effective post-market surveillance process.
And I'll jump in and add to that as well, just to sort of embellish kind of on the point of post-market surveillance and what is it. So typically companies, as you quite rightly said, you should have it. It's obligated. It's, you know, it's a process that's required by the regulations. So it's something that you're not going to have a workaround. As engineers, it's such a rich source. It's a gold mine for innovation. Because as you said, all that feedback, you're going to know about it. And there's going to be different levels of post-market feedback. So let's take sort of related to the risk as we were talking before. You might end up with, fingers crossed you don't, but you could end up with adverse events or, you know, some sort of an incident in the field. And so for that, you've got reporting requirements and obligations that you'd need to meet. So you've got to monitor those adverse events, monitor your complaints, and also, like, when you're monitoring complaints, it might not be direct information that's going into your normal channels. It might, you know, consider the media of communication that people can get that post-market surveillance information back to you. It could be like social media, it could be forums. You know, it's so powerful these days that it might not be somebody ringing up front desk and going, yeah, I've got this device and it's broken, or it's hurt my kid, or it's malfunctioned, or whatever. So there's those kind of passive surveillance techniques, but there's also active. And I think that's what is really, it'd be really nice to kind of, if we see more design engineering teams embracing that active surveillance, so they're proactively collecting data, we're looping back around now to our user surveys, to our focus groups, clinical registries, direct outreach. So really finding out, what do you really think about this product? You know, it's been out, it's been, you know, however long, and having this kind of warts and all conversations with our users. So I think that would be my point, is to consider the types of PMS, post-market surveillance data that you can actually gather and how it's going to help you innovate for your next gen or a different variant of your product.
I guess I'll answer this question from an innovation perspective. Let's just say you are developing a breakthrough, radical innovation. It's Gen 1, you've done all your design requirements and it's going into market. And those design requirements have set a threshold of what is good enough for that device to go into the market. And you've met that and you might have exceeded it a little bit. But as an engineer, you're always thinking about the next generation anyway, right? You're always thinking about improving that that previous generation. So you're always trying to learn. So when that previous generation goes in the market and the users start to really get their hands on it, because medical devices can't be used like normal products before they've been approved, right? So it's only really when they've been approved and gone to the market they can be actually properly used. And that's always the problem with medical engineering. As medical engineers, we've got a problem that we're the ones that we can't actually use our products on patients because we're not doctors, right? We're always secondhand. Same with aerospace engineers as well. They can't actually, well, probably some of them do have pilot's licenses, but they can't go into space and things like that. They can't use their products. The same problem with medical engineers, unlike automotive engineers who can get in the car and drive it around the racetrack. So we're always thinking about the next generation when we start learning how the previous generation worked, and we're talking to those healthcare professionals and getting that input. We always think about how we can improve that next generation. And that's really where the innovation happens, is on the family of incremental generations, which really actually make the money, is the incremental innovations once that first radical one's gone in the market. And that's what you always should be thinking about, is the next one.
Yeah, I think the only bit I'd add to that is sometimes as experts in this field, it's quite easy to get defensive over our designs and to take these kind of inputs as criticisms rather than opportunities to iterate. So, you know, absolutely everything that the panel said is 100% accurate. I think it's sometimes just a little bit of a mindset piece to just be able to see this as opportunities to iterate and produce better rather than take it as a negative. So yeah, definitely keep that one in mind as you receive those insights.
Brilliant. So I have just opened up the Q&A. If anyone wants to ask any questions to our panel, or just in general, we'll give it a minute or two, because hopefully I figured out how it works. Fingers crossed. But we'll see. If not, we'll go from there.
I can see it. It's open.
Yay! No questions? Okay.
Oh, we got hands raised.
Unfortunately, I can't unmute or turn on any cameras.
You can. I think you can.
Yeah, I've just allowed Mike on.
Hi, am I audible to everyone here?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not particularly a medical engineer. I'm just doing an engineering degree, but I have started a project regarding the medical side of engineering. So particularly exoskeleton and exosuits. So in that particularly for disabled people, so like people with medical needs. So in that particular project, I'm currently at the creative stage, so like the starting stage of the project. So in that, the question that I want to ask is, what is the most reliable source for like getting data regarding the anatomy and physiology of human body? So like about the movements, about the physics in that, and like material and stuff, because we need like constraints to start a design, right? So I just wanted to know that your opinions on that, and what are like the most reliable sources to get all this data to start this. Yeah.
It depends what part of the body you're working on. So yes, there's manuals, surgeon manuals for every part of the body, and they're quite extensive. I'm just trying to remember who the publisher is. I can't remember who the publisher publishes them all. A Blue Spine theme, I think it is. Give me a second.
While Stuart's thinking about that, I guess to answer, and excuse me, I won't answer super specifically because it's not my area of expertise, but there's definitely multiple different sources that you can use in order to obtain that data. As Stuart said, there'll be some surgeon manuals, there'll be academic papers, there'd be the opportunity to go and directly see your patient population as well. So really, it's up to it's sort of driven a little bit by you in the sort of design brief stage for what you're trying to achieve. To look at those various different sources, select the ones that might be most appropriate for your design. Where there's gaps, go and do some of that front end sort of user characterization to inform the basis for your design work. Sorry, I know I've answered very top level on that. I don't know if anybody else has got anything else to add.
YouTube videos are the best. Just go and find YouTube videos of surgeries or whatever type of medical device you're trying to develop. And if you're early on in your career, watch a ton of YouTube videos. And obviously, there's a ton of stuff on the internet nowadays. Speaking like an old man. But when I started, the internet didn't exist. Yeah, the publisher who produces the most detailed anatomy books is on the chat if you want to have a look. But they are really expensive. If you're not going to make a career out of being a hip engineer or heart engineer or neurosurgeon, probably don't buy them. But you probably can find some copies on the internet somewhere.
And just to touch on Stuart's YouTube point, ViewMedi is also a very good source for surgeon or surgery videos. Sometimes some of the YouTube stuff gets blocked for gruesome features and things like that. So ViewMedi is a very good source for different surgeries.
And if they're
I'm working on a breast augmentation product at the moment. You'd not believe how much I'm getting banned from the internet at the moment. Anyway,
Yeah, and outside
Sorry,
of sort of the surgical side of things, there again, I'd have to go and have a look for the actual specific standard number, but there are guides for ergonomics and anthropometrics, so body sizes of different populations, so you can actually get some rough measurements. So that might be I would imagine your library would have access to something like that, but that might help them with like biomechanical modeling and things like that. I know we've certainly, when I've worked on patient support equipment and other things where we need to cater for people of different sizes, basically, that was a really great resource, and I think it was relatively cheap. I can't remember the standard off the top of my head, but there is definitely one out there that will do that, and it's got variants, it's got sort of tables in the back, basically, with the distributions as well, so you can cater for your 95th percentiles, whatever range you need it to accommodate as well, internationally. So that might be something worth having a look at, for depending on the product.
Brilliant. So we've got another question from a current sixth form student who's looking to go into the field. As medical devices are becoming increasingly more digital and AI integrated, how would the user-centered design process evolve to account for any interactions between humans and intelligence system, and not only as physical devices? It's a good question. I like that.
Come on, Matt. This is Matt's area.
Wow. Okay. So just let me go through the question again here. So an interaction with human. So
scroll down, I'm going to need to read it.
Yeah.
I can't see it. Where is it?
I think it's there's a button at the top of the screen for Q&A. It's separate from the chat.
Oh, got it. Right. Okay. Thank you.
No worries. So I think AI is a really interesting one, because we're already, when you look at the intersection of digital and physical devices, we have maybe one user, maybe it's multiple users that are interacting with a particular device at any given time, and they have very separate requirements. So we've already talked about the importance of drilling down, understanding that real world use case, what the varying needs are through people, and then kind of like translating those of, we've talked about, kind of weight and torque and things from physical device, but then on digital side, we have kind of accessibility as well as usability. So, the specifics around, color contrasts, font size, things like that, to make sure that whatever the use setting is, it's accessible. When we layer in AI, I think what that presents a challenge there as well, beyond those two areas, is the kind of trust piece. So it's then less around how you're interacting with a device, and it's more around how are you as a designer ensuring that there's kind of trust and transparency behind what is kind of being output on there. So I think, looking at the context of what the talk's around today, the opportunity there is to really early on engage in what are those additional reinforcements that users would need to be able to trust, the kind of outputs that the AI will be generating, and what are the concerns there? What do those translate into those, again, design inputs like we spoke about earlier? And then, just, I guess, continuing as normal. It doesn't really change the process. It's more just about understanding what those nuances are and being able to capture the additional needs that are around those. That's what I'd go for.
Yeah, I agree. I think that as well, short term with the processes, and when I say processes, I'm particularly leaning towards kind of the compliance aspects and the regulation standards, guidelines side of it. They don't move quick, unfortunately. So when we're looking at the user-centered design process evolving, that's much more likely to be with us design development engineers than it is with the rule makers, because we're still waiting for things like AI and medical devices. There's standards, they're percolating, but the technology is moving significantly faster than those kind of organisations can actually keep pace with. So I think in the meantime, yes, they are old, but they've been sort of relatively tried and tested, and we've at least got a framework, whether we like it or not, to work to. And so we can use those philosophies and those principles for design for safety and usability in the meantime. And then at some point, yeah, we should be getting some of these standards and regulations and acts coming through. But I think it's going to take a long time. I think we could quite exciting that we're going to see significant developments in medical device technologies by the before they actually hit the ground and we can actually use them, so which actually presents quite a nice opportunity, because we've got a window where we can work with the existing framework and innovate highly in that time before we've got another set of frameworks and guidance and regs and whatever that we need to work to. So yeah.
Yeah, completely agree. I think we're supporting a couple of med device manufacturers at the moment who are kind of looking at like kind of nice guidelines around robotic assisted surgery and what that means for post-market surveillance, which is a nice tie back to what we were speaking about earlier. And they're trying to kind of face into that space of, well, if we have a laparoscopic robotic assisted surgery platform, how on earth do we do post-market surveillance with patients, because they won't know that they've been operated on by this particular machine? And maybe actually is there a patient benefit for laparoscopic? Maybe not. And is a big surgeon benefit? Is there a patient one? Maybe not. But the point is that NICE have kind of said we want to do something better around post-market surveillance, but we're actually looking for you as the manufacturers to kind of come back to us and help give us steer on what that should look like. So yeah, to your point, Laurie, absolutely. I think it's almost kind of back on our shoulders to say, well, actually, this is how we feel we should evolve our own processes to make those changes. Yeah.
And I'd just quickly add as well that not to forget that there are things like the breakthrough programs and innovative device access programs as well, depending on what jurisdiction and what side of the pond you live in, or that you're designing for. There's those as well. So there is still scope for things that are really novel and that are dealing with those high clinical need situations. There is still like a path through. It's not like we're completely lacking in guidance. It's just that it's evolving, I think.
Amazing. So the next question we have is, do you have any advice for retrospective design controls, specifically when brought into relatively mature projects where user requirements and design inputs are not properly documented before proceeding? Stuart, I saw that you popped the response to that one.
Well, yeah, this is a part. The reason I said that is because previously to MDR, you didn't have to do much retrospective work. MDR no longer allows grandfathering, and you have to go back and if you're going to go for MDR for a legacy device, you have to go back and complete all the documents that should have been done if it was a brand new device on that day. So retrospective design controls in Europe under MDR is not really a thing anymore because there's no grandfathering clause. When you have to renew your CE mark, you have to do all of the work. Like if it doesn't exist, like your requirements management, your risk management, usability, all that documentation has to be completed to the current design controls, unfortunately. And if you've got an old product, especially if it's a complicated product with software in it and electronics, and you're not sure where all that stuff is coming from, that can be a significant amount of work. And it's like an NPD at that point. You're actually redeveloping an existing device to meet MDR. So it's a problem. And that's why medical device manufacturers have been moaning for the past 10 years on MDR, because they've had to go back and redo all their documentation of products that have been out in the market for a very long time, have a lot of post-market surveillance data showing they're safe and efficacious, but we still have to go and update all our documents.
I think Oh, sorry, Stuart, carry on.
No, I just said hopefully that answers your question, but go, Richard.
I think the only thing that I've got to add to that is, I completely agree on all of those points, But just to touch on the post-market surveillance, if you've got devices that have been out in the field for a long time, as we talked about earlier, you've got a really rich pool of data to pull from. So although you're required to go back and redo that whole design control piece, you should actually have a stronger body of evidence to do that than you would do if you were starting from scratch.
Yeah,
I think it depends, doesn't it, on what you mean by sort of retrospective design controls. It could be a transition piece. It could be, I mean, we see quite a lot, to be honest, especially on the class ones where they've been self-declared. Things can be out in the field for a really long time. I think the oldest one we worked on last year been in the field for in excess of 40 years, and had been distributed to NATO as well. So this product was really out there, and they'd never, I think it was so old that they'd never the company managed to never comply with any of the regulations or anything as they emerged. So as the old CE marking standard and medical device directive kicked in, they didn't comply when that emerged, and then it certainly didn't comply afterwards, let alone sort of convert into the medical device regulations or to the UK MDR, etc. So it kind of depends like how old the product is and what you mean by retrospective, because retrospective could mean like things being added to a product when it's already been on the market, like features, functions, or it could mean pivoting. So it's got one intended use and it's going now to be different indications intended use. Or it could be that it's an old product and people never did the documentation stack as they were supposed to. We see that all the time, and it's not a headache if you know what you're doing. I suppose that's what keeps us in business, is that we're the fixers and we're here to kind of, you know, sort that documentation stack out. But I'd certainly say have faith, and it's not impossible. And if it's a mature product, tracing that should be reasonably straightforward. It's just time consuming, and being systematic might help in that approach, because you're not innovating at that point. You are documenting and cataloging. You're writing about a product that's already out there, and as you say, Richard, there should be a rich body of evidence to support efficacy and safety and performance and so forth. So yeah, you just have to be prepared to have a bit of a slog, and just work through the process. You said it was for US, so work through your design control systematically, and then you should hit the requirements in that respect.
yeah.
Amazing.
And it also depends on class. US classification. If it's class 1,
Yep.
you can take a bit more of an easier road.
Okay. Would we like to move on to the next question? So this one is from somebody that works in robotics and is at a crossroads of a novel design development where the new surgeons are very handy with the interfaces due to growing up with gaming consoles, and older surgeons who have less experience in this area. Do you have any advice to deal with polar opposite user feedback?
Yes, but not the answer you probably want. Two ways of doing it. Develop two different products because they're both different user needs. Probably in a robot that's probably not financially feasible. The other one is sort of a tough one, and because of medical devices last in the field so long, have such long lifespans, it comes to, and I'll get a bit academic here, a theory called the paradigm shift by Thomas Kuhn from the 1960s. And the paradigm shift is basically people who have been using a technology for so long are not going to change. So only the new people coming along are going to start using the next technology. And the way society changes is the old people retire and die off, basically. And then the new people using the new technology adapt it, and that's what changes society. And that is a 20 to 30 year cycle that goes on and on and on. That is probably not the best answer, but that is the academic answer of the paradigm shift, or develop two different products. And it might be like a robot. The robot might be the same, but it might be actually the user interface might be different for the people who are interacting with it, how they expect it to use. And we see that all the time, right? Our computers and our phones are adaptable to the way we want it to use. There's not just one set way that the user interface works nowadays. So it might be you start thinking about different user interfaces for different groups of users.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good answer. I think it is difficult. And we saw something fairly similar with a change from, and I'm going to horrendously gender stereotype here, but a group of orthopedic surgeons being predominantly male, predominantly of a certain build, and the transition to newer graduating surgeons is a much more varied pool of physical characteristics. So I guess in that same sort of in the same way, Stuart's right. Your two options are design with multiple different user groups in mind, or I guess taking it back a step further, understand whether there's anything that you can do that makes that older population ever likely to use your device. Because if they're not actually a user, then we don't consider them as a user. If you can do anything to that product that you could do anything and they still aren't going to use it, then why are we considering them?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was gonna say, to be honest. I totally agree with you, Richard, because what you could be looking at is that you're trying to innovate for an old school clinical philosophy when actually you could be on the brink of a breakthrough. So if you took those constraints away and that you didn't have to cater for old school technique, it could be that the actual clinical approach might alter, and it could be for the better. So that's one thing. So I agree with Richard, question whether it's actually kind of necessary. From a commercial perspective, is it necessary? So do those use, are you going to completely ruin your commercial, your revenue opportunities if you don't cater for that user group? If they're already they do what they like to do and they're they know how they're approaching that particular surgical methodologies and they're happy with that. Well, what if they just weren't included in that respect? Because what you could end up doing is, you want to have a think about how that's going to impact your bottom line. Because it might be, again, that might be another reason why you just don't need to upset the apple cart too much with respect to your user group. Just focus on the people that will adopt and embrace it and maximize that as a potential user group and not worry too much about catering to the other one, and provided that that's not going to kill your company and you're not relying on people adopting it, that's another way of thinking about it. It's going back to those core elements we discussed right at the beginning of the call.
Brilliant. I think we have time for one more question. So this is from someone who's making exoskeletons in a group at university, and they have issues with the adjustable devices to fit a wide range of users. Do you have any advice for handling an unknown range of users, or would something like the 95th percentile height fix this?
So when you say continue to count issues that are not fitting a wide range, when you're testing it with your users, is it not fitting your actual users, or is it a perceived problem that they're saying, I don't think it would fit the entire population? Those are two different types of feedback. So if it's fitting the actual person you're testing on, it works. If then they're consequently saying something like, oh, I don't think this is going to be adaptable to everybody, that is secondary information that you need to be a bit more cautious of, right? Because they're not speaking from a place of education there. So you could be taking a design input that's not actually a design input there. So I'm not sure from your question where those two things are coming from. You've got your user group, and that's a set as this type of device, right? So that you'll specify your age, your gender, because it's an external product, the races it's going to be used on, because everybody has different biomechanics. That always has to be set early on, your user groups. And then you can start collecting the anthropometric data on all of those user groups. And then see if your device actually matches it. And that's your design verification part of it. Then you can do your validations. Just be cautious of what the users are actually telling you, and really listen to the words they're saying. Is it them, or is it the wider people they're talking about? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to that. I think the only thing that I would be slightly cautious of, I think we talked about earlier about using standards. I think Laurie mentioned 7250, which is the basic human body measurements. It's just really important to make sure that if you're choosing to use that, that is representative of your population. And what I mean by that is that standard covers everybody, right? And if your device is only to be used by a subsection of that data set, then there's as much, if not more, value in going and collecting that data for your user group. And I don't have a huge amount else to add to that.
I was going to say, is that everything added? Well, I think this will be a good place for us to wrap up, I think. Thank you to everyone that's joined. I hope you've enjoyed this IED webinar. Thank you so much to our amazing panel who has given so much insight to user needs. It's been brilliant talking to you, and I'm very grateful that you've all given up your time and come to speak to us. So from me, the panel, and the IED, thank you for joining, and we hope you have a good rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thanks for